problem which has plagued the LCS scene in particular is hiring competent coaching staff. And actually, this is a problem worldwide. It's bigger than esports itself, but it's the difficulty of hiring practices, within entire businesses and whatnot, right? Because I mean, LCS teams, all they really are just businesses, right? So if you're a GM, you were hired by the owner or the CEO, right? That person actually is quite competent within the space, or at least you got to think that, right? And we can think of owners like Steve or Reginald or Ocelot, Jack, Hot Shot before, right? Nade Shot, etc. All these guys, besides Jack, right, have been pro players and have deep connections within the entire scene to kind of cross vet their GM, but also have just the eye themselves to vet the GM, right? Except like Nade Shot, I guess, right? But like I said, he can kind of cross vet their GMs. And then you have the instance of Jack, to where he's been in the scene for so long that you can kind of just ride that out, to where it's like, okay, through process of elimination, he can eventually find who is a good GM and who isn't, right? Also, in regards to, Hot Shot, of course, you just have to pray that hopefully he got competent GMs in the past, which then trickled down to competent staff, and hoping, not all of them leave at once, leaving a gigantic void, which maybe you could say actually happened with CLG. Who the fuck knows? But also, it's the idea that usually, all of these former pro players lose their competency within the space over a longer span of time. And with that said, that means that you have to hire competent staff while your knowledge is actually relevant about the space in and of itself. And although I don't think their entire knowledge about the space necessarily goes away entirely, right, after they've been done becoming a pro player and it's been a couple years, I don't think it just suddenly disappears, but it certainly goes down a lot because, of course, as their company expands to different titles and whatnot, they can't keep 100% focus on just League of Legends. As someone who would necessarily be like a coach of League of Legends, or just the GM of League of Legends itself, right? So with that said, your competency is going to lower with time, especially as the company scales, and you have to rely upon your staff more and more as a company scales, right? And this is just a business practice in and of itself, right? That's normally why any CEO worth their salt has to hire very competent people to then run everything else. And it's kind of as though it's in their hands, say if you're like someone that runs an entire, I don't know, restaurant store or chain, and you have 10 different restaurants all throughout California, you got to make sure your store managers or your store directors are like really on point. So with that said, how does a GM know, say, that a head coach or analyst is competent? Right now, there really isn't any clear way for them to know, other than for them to be a good or at least a half decent head coach or analyst themselves, to understand the game at a very high level and understand the personalities there within the pro scene to a high level, right? So that means that the GM then has to ask either assistant coaches or former players, right, to get like testimonials, which, I mean, if you've ever been in any court system, testimonials aren't the best thing, right? And on top of that, the livelihood of these assistant coaches or players are inherently attached to all the head coaches within the entire scene. So now you have this sort of bias that is already built in within the system in and of itself, right? And you try and remove that bias through having a GM that hires all these other guys. But if all of your knowledge is based upon those people, then you inherently break the system or the advantage that the GM has initially anyways, right? As far as being the outside hiring that then hires the head coach or the analyst, etc. And then on top of that, you have, okay, well, if you do get a head coach, the head coach has to hire his analysts. And the analysts' competency is judged by the head coach and also in part two, the GM. And so you begin this cyclical process, right? To where all these hiring practices rely upon feedback from someone below them or someone within that entire system, and there is no objective reality as to how to judge these people based upon their skill itself. And I think this is why nepotism exists, in particular in the pro League of Legends scene, because it's the only fallback to judge someone and I guess their merits, right? And we can get to merits maybe here too, is that there needs to be some way for incompetent people to know if someone is competent, right? And like I said before, I think in another video, the word competency has such like a negative connotation to it. And it seems as though people think the vocabulary of what competency actually means is that you can never exactly attain knowledge of a particular subject or whatnot. No, it just means you don't know something in a particular field. Don't be afraid to be incompetent. That doesn't mean that you can stay within that state forever, right? But anyways, so this is why I think bachelor degrees are so prized, or college degrees, associates, whatever the fuck. It theoretically tells you that someone is competent, right? So that says that you as a company don't necessarily have 4 years to vet someone, right? Based upon the basic mathematical skills that they maybe need to have as a computer programmer in order to then program in Python or C++ or C# or whatever, right? So this is essentially a bottleneck in order to get the vetting process started. It's not everything, of course, but it's at least a good start. This is why colleges exist, right? It's essentially a bottleneck. And I think one of the bigger proponents of this entire idea of that it's difficult to vet coaching staffs is LS, right? I think he's made the point that it doesn't really matter how long you've been in a position, right? Like tenureship doesn't really matter in the grand scheme of things. And I would argue partially against that in the fact that when you do study, or rather when you're in a particular field for a certain amount of time, you will naturally learn about that field, right? You will naturally gain skills within that field just because you are within it itself. And I don't think he's talking about in a vacuum just as that as an absolute. I think he might give some credibility towards that. But I think there is the idea that you can do something wrong basically the entire time, right? You could always think of, that 2 + 1 = 5, right? And if you start with that fundamental basis, everything else is kind of fucked, right? Everything about your entire idea of arithmetic is entirely screwed over. And so then that taints everything else, of course, right? So it does matter initially how you go about learning a particular subject and maybe who you learn from. And as well, too, a greater concept of this entire idea to where it really doesn't matter how long you've been in a position is, of course, the 10,000 hour rule, to where if you do something for 10,000 hours, that at least puts you in the door of to what mastery actually is. But the key distinction between this and being in a position for a long time is the fact that the 10,000 hour rule essentially means that you've been doing things specifically for a certain amount of time. It boils it down to a greater distillation. It says that you literally have done this for 10,000 hours, right? You've sit there, you have thought about, this particular subject or whatever, like say esports journalism, right? You've written a lot, you have thought about the process a lot, you've done tons of interviews, you've done, all the little things that make up esports journalism. And you've done that for 10,000 hours specifically. And it's not how long you've necessarily been in that position, because you could be a guy that fucking writes an article, once every month. Not calling anyone out for that shit. But you can then say that you've been an esports journalist for 5 years. But really, that doesn't matter if you don't put out any content, right? If you only put out, a couple pieces in an entire year, right? A couple videos or a couple articles or interviews throughout the entire year, that's great. But your entire idea of what you said was 5 years actually really is kind of a lie when you think about it, because my 5 years is different from your 5 years if I do 100 pieces in a year, right? And you only do 10. There's a very big difference in that, right? So I think instead of what some considered was a great idea, which was the esports certification, the big criticism of that was that the site was too broad, right? It's like, what the fuck is an esports certification anyways, right? Because the jobs within esports are very broad, very wide ranging, right? You could be someone that does content creation, right? You could be a video editor, you could be a coach, you could be you could be an analyst, which are completely you could be a head coach, you could be a GM. There's a whole bunch of different jobs within esports itself, to where that certification doesn't make a whole lot of sense. But when you think of something as such of a standardized test, not a certification, but a standardized test where esports analysts and coaches, could be necessarily vetted, right? Because it's more of a boiled down to a very specific type of job, right? So this is where the actual test would then be much more applicable to that particular position or person, because you're only doing maybe one or maybe two job titles, right? Which are very translatable, I guess. And of course, with this said, right, like theoretically, if you were to make this test, say a third party, and I were to create this test, and maybe I'm a website or a company, and I wanted to create a test that would test the ability or the competency of analysts or of coaches, of course you would need a initial good team of analysts and coaches to help develop it, which would be a problem in and of itself. But I think that would be an easier problem to tackle, because also you only have to do it once generally. And then, of course, with this idea of creating this standardized test, as I would call it, you would have to change the topics or the subjects there within basically every year, right? Because some type of knowledge gets outdated, right? Patches change very regularly. And also you have to fight for authenticity, right? You don't want the answers to be leaked or whatever, or coaches copying other coaches because they're sharing all these answers or whatever the fuck. So this would have to be a regular thing every year, kind of, like the SATs or whatever, and how they change answers and whatnot. But this idea would at least allow teams to have a fighting chance to generally test the competency of these people within managerial positions. And even if you don't want a site to have that much control, right, over your organization, if you're a team owner as such, at the very least, you as an org need to implement a test like this, because you yourself as an owner aren't competent about the duties of a head coach or of an analyst too. Like, that's probably pretty obvious. So you need to have some way in order to vet these people. And I think, as with all things, there is, of course, the caveat, which is that the one big problem is that tests are notoriously very difficult to create due to, biases, imperfections, etc., maybe different ways in which people can apply their knowledge as such, which is why you need different formats of that test to be able to test different ways, right? You need a speech portion of the test, right? You need a written portion of the test. You also need some like critical thinking portion of the test, where the test is more dynamic instead of, fucking multiple choice. Instead, it's write your fucking answer down. And this is also why I think IQ tests and even the SAT is criticized, but you'll still notice that all of these tests, grades, etc., are just, they're essentially just checkpoints to figure out the competency for, colleges accepting high school students, and then of course that funnels into for jobs to accept college graduates, for patients to accept PhDs only as being their doctors, right? Everything at some point has to funnel down, because no one can have ultimate competency about everything and every particular, I guess, member or staff within their entire company, right? Especially as companies scale larger and larger. And this might be an indictment, I guess, of as to maybe the maximum capacity that a company can necessarily grow in terms of maximum competency as well too. But that's a side tangent. The point is that you need some kind of funnel, because you cannot know everything. And so with that, I think standardized testing would be a great way to do that, as long as you have a very knowledgeable team in order to do this. But the difficulty of that too comes along with the costs to be able to implement something like this, because of course it takes, money in order to hire these prolific or smart analysts in order to create a test which everyone then can do themselves. Then also you have the problem of, well, those analysts now are part of that group which created the tests, and then they may be tested upon that later on, right? So you have that entire debacle. But I think if people or organizations, or maybe a website of some sort, or a company or a startup is able to figure out the idea of how to create a standardized test for specifically coaches and analysts, I think that can benefit the League of Legends scene incredibly. And I think this could be a snowballing effect as to how to maybe improve both the player aspects within an entire organization, and how maybe player talent is picked up, how rosters are constructed, right? Because of the whole GM aspect and the competency of that. But I think just this initial idea in and of itself could be quite revolutionary in that sense. And I think really this is the key to kind of unlocking the consistency, which may, bear more fruit than exactly what is going on today, which is a little bit more nepotism than a lot of people would like to see within the scene.